Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and my guest today is Amy Ward Brimmer, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Philadelphia. We're going to talk about negative directions, sometimes called inhibitory directions. We've had an earlier conversation, and we're going to do some follow-up discussions on this topic. And as we did before, we're going to flip the usual format so that Amy will actually be interviewing me. So, Amy, take it away.
Robert, it's great to be with you today, and I'm happy to have this chance to follow up because I've actually been, both with myself and my students, experimenting a little bit more than usual with negative or inhibitory directions. And so, just briefly, for people who haven't heard the first conversation we had, in a sentence or two, what are negative directions, or how are they different from what we usually think of as directing?
Well, the usual kinds of Alexander directions, take the classic one, um, my neck to be free, or I am freeing my neck, or I am letting my neck be free. Those are kind of the classic ones, and the inhibitory or negative version of that would be something like, I am not tensing my neck. So there's a no statement there. And the basic reason why I think they are in many ways superior to the classic directions is that they make absolutely no assumptions about what you can and can't do, in the sense that everyone can tense their neck or tighten or squeeze or constrict or whatever word you want to use, and everyone knows what no means. And so they don't assume that the student can do anything that they can't do. But, for example, I'm not letting my neck be free, which is, I would say, the best version of the classical direction, assumes that a student knows how to let their neck be free. And
Yes.
I've come over time to the belief that that's not necessarily true. And it wasn't even necessarily true for me, who'd been
hmm
teaching almost 30 years. So I've pretty much switched entirely to negative directions, which I think have all kinds of advantages, but certainly starting with the fact that they make no assumptions that aren't pretty likely to be true.
Yeah, and I just actually had a really interesting, outside of an Alexander teaching situation, I had a very interesting response to that situation in a mindfulness course that I'm taking, where the teacher was, in preparation for meditation, was asking uh, folks to sit, with their spines upright and to let their, she was giving some physical directions for how to assume a good meditation posture or position. And she was talking about, letting the head just balance delicately at the top of the spine. And I thought, well, that's wonderful. Except most of the people in this room wouldn't know if they were doing that or not. And I immediately thought of negative directions. And so um, I can see that this is the kind of situation where, with a student or with yourself, you could easily say, not so much let my head be balancing at the top of my spine, but not, I am not pulling my head down, for example, or
Or
not,
I'm not holding my neck on top of my spine, or I'm not tightening my neck, not fixing my head. Those would be possibilities to explore, I would think, in that situation.
and so then I actually, in that moment when I heard that, even though I, from experience, could easily, find that balancing point or poising place at the top of my spine, I sort of for a moment pretended that I couldn't and just used negative directions, and immediately felt, by saying, and I'm not tightening and I'm not fixing a position, that, so I immediately personally had that experience. And then it made me think, what's the difference between negative directions or inhibitory directions and non-doing?
Um, I don't know if there is a difference. I'm
hmm
I'm thinking off the top of my head here, In fact, I think a very useful negative direction that is especially useful when you're doing constructive rest or lying in bed is I'm not doing anything. That's kind of the ultimate non-doing, or even just say I'm not doing.
Right. And so, is there ever a time when that's counterproductive or, um,
Well, I think if you're in the midst of an activity, say walking or chopping vegetables or something, saying I'm not doing anything might not be. I don't really know. I'm not sure. But I think you're better off in saying I'm not doing. If let's say you're walking, if you say I'm not walking while you continue to do something that sure looks a lot like walking, but if you experiment with that and shift back and forth between I'm not walking and then for a few seconds and then just walk, or even say I am walking, I think you'll pretty quickly notice a difference. Typically, when you say I'm not walking, what you're doing is stripping away the extra stuff that you've associated with walking. You've kind of said to yourself, to your psychophysical system, if you like, guys, take care of this. I don't want to do what I have habitually been doing. Figure out a better way for me, and inevitably, your body mind does that.
That's I have recently had a great story from a student who told me that he did this when he was late for a meeting and had to walk about 6 blocks to another building to be on time, and he was already late. And he tried this. He said he was in a real hurry, and the whole time he was walking very quickly from point A to point B, and the entire time he said, "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not hurrying. I'm not walking quickly." And his experience with that was that he arrived actually on time for his meeting
Yeah.
and arrived in a state of what he calls sort of aware and relaxed.
Yeah, that's a
Those were his
perfect
words.
application. Because if you look at, think for anyone listening, think of what happens when they are in a rush. Typically, they distort their walking pattern. They might push their chest forward a little bit,
Hmm.
or whatever their pattern is. They'll exaggerate the worst aspects of their walking in the same way that people who run often exaggerate the worst aspects of their walking.
Hmm.
And so by saying I'm not walking, and I like that one, I'm not hurrying, that's an excellent one.
Well, moving very quickly, right?
Well,
Where
but they could still be moving as quickly as they want, but they just say to themselves, I'm not hurrying.
yes.
You see, so um, yeah, that's a nice one. I hadn't thought of that one. And I have to say that one of the beauties of negative directions in general is that my students at least have taken to them in the sense that they're always trying to explore new ones and see, oh, here's a way maybe I can use these. They really love to use them in a way that I never found was the case with classic directions quite as much. It seems like they're very empowering because they're easy to use. There are all kinds of variations on them that individuals can think up for themselves. So, from my point of view, as an Alexander teaching process, I think they're really excellent.
They can be, but I also have kind of another question for you
Hmm.
based on some uh, application in the studio with particularly a couple of students who are new within maybe they've had 4 or 5 lessons, not very long amount of time,
Hmm.
and in doing chair work and say moving from sitting to standing.
Hmm.
For a while, I was only asking them to not pull their heads back and down or not do whatever it was that was keeping them from moving easily from sitting to standing. And then I would try having them add the spatial directions, like really projecting the thought of forward and up, while also not tightening, sort of the classic.
Right.
way of working, and that actually did seem to work better. That my question is sort of, again, this is very early application and people who are still really learning the mind body process, but it seemed to help to have a positive direction on top of it. Just not tightening didn't seem to provide the momentum mentally and physically. And so I'm wondering how, for teachers who are probably, more the people who are listening to these kinds of discussions about negative directions, is there a time in the process of teaching with a student that it would be better to start introducing pure negative directions? Do we also need to, before that, maybe make sure they understand um, what we would call positive directions? Or do you have any
Hmm.
experience with when is a good time to introduce this? Um,
To introduce positive directions or negative?
Negative or positive. It just,
Yeah.
my experience recently, it's been for some of my students, it's been hard for them to find the kind of buoyancy and ease in movement solely applying negative direct. Just not doing or inhibiting doesn't quite give them the. It seems to help some of them to be really projecting a positive direction. I'm not tensing my neck and I'm thinking forward and up as I move.
Well, if they can pull that off, that's fine. Bear in mind that with Alexander directions in general, having two of them is a lot trickier than twice the amount of having one. I mean, every new direction you add, you're taking up another little memory slot there, and we only have, whatever it is, 7 ± 2 available slots, most of which are taken up with other things. So if you can reduce it to one, or maybe one trick that I use a lot with students is instead of trying to project two separate directions at the same time, alternate quickly between one and another so that in any one split second they're only doing one, which is a lot easier than trying to do two. The other thing, in terms of, say, standing up from a chair, I've found that a really useful negative direction that I've been experimenting a lot with lately is I'm not compressing myself. It's kind of a
Ah,
very general one. It's as general as I'm not um, uh, tightening or tensing myself, which is the one I had been using a lot. But compressing, or say not compressing my spine, um, seems to have a little more of a three-dimensional quality to it for some reason.
yeah.
And I find that if I ask a student who's sitting in a chair, if I say, well, I'd like you in a little while to get onto your feet, I don't like to call it standing up because that triggers all kinds of habitual responses. I'd like you to
Right.
get onto your feet, but the most important thing is I'd like you to be clear that you're not compressing yourself as you do that. But I also say, of course, you're likely to forget it part way up or who knows when. And don't worry about that, but just bring it back. But there are a couple of critical moments typically one would be when you first begin, and another
Mm,
might be when you actually arrive on your feet. And there's
yes.
a strong temptation to stand up as you have habitually been doing. Um, so I don't know. I haven't had quite that problem, but I could see that it might be useful to add a positive direction alternating with a negative one, or maybe work with them a little using a positive direction and then switch over to negative.
Well,
Um,
that's interesting that you say that because that's actually what I ended up doing is in a lesson having them play with both and see what
See what
their
the difference
experience of
is.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what I'm finding is that they apply the positive direction first, like almost like they're projecting, okay, I know I'm going to be moving in this direction, and they think that direction, and then they do whatever they need to do to, initiate the movement with the negative direction. So it's kind
Hmm.
of they sort of plan what direction they're moving in, but then they don't let themselves move until they're negatively directing. So I can kind of see how the two could interplay with each other.
Hmm. Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
the one place that I have found, both for myself and my students, that it's easiest to apply this is in semi-supine when we're in constructive rest. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. At the Alexander lying down position, or
Yeah.
just lying in bed at night. I
Mm,
think anything that you can do in semi-supine, you can also do when you're lying down, whether it's on your back or your side or whatever. The beauty of constructive rest, of course, is that the mechanics of it tends to encourage all kinds of useful things just all by itself. But to me, constructive rest is all about, at least in part, about um, kind of recalibrating what zero is for you. That is, most people, when they think they're, well, Alexander said, in fact, most people, when they think they're thinking, are doing, and when they think they're doing, they're overdoing. And so people who are lying down may think, oh, I'm not doing anything to be here. But of course, we know they quite likely are doing some extra stuff. Um, because their idea of zero is just not correct. And so lying down, there are various strategies. Certainly, the I'm not breathing is a nice one to bring in when you're lying down because you can pretty easily sense the results of that because there's not a lot of other stuff going on to get in your way of
hmm
noticing it. Of course, it's a two-edged sword because noticing it carries with it its own traps of trying to keep it that way. So it's the same problems you have with any directions. But most students with a little bit of practice will immediately sense that their breathing becomes freer and fuller when they simply say to themselves, "I'm not breathing," meaning that's shorthand for I'm not breathing in the way I have habitually been breathing. Body mind figure out a better way for me. And body mind is very good at that, extremely good at that,
Yes, I've noticed.
very good at that. Um, and the other one, and that and this other one both come out of Missy Vinyard's book, is I'm not lying on the table. That's a real interesting one because most people assume that when they're lying on the table, they're not doing anything. And if they say, well, I'm not lying on the table, your body mind says, well, I wonder if there's a better way, in other words, a less effortful way that you could do it. And some people notice a lot from that right away, and others, like myself, I would say, have not noticed it at first very much. That one was a lot trickier for me personally, but now I do that when I'm lying in bed or lying on the table, and I can sense a little release for me, particularly around my shoulders, which are still kind of tight, and so that's a really useful place to apply these. Yeah.
Yeah, it just, it makes me think that there's that idea of doing something like lying down and telling yourself I'm not lying down is kind of different than that negative thing of just don't do drugs or just don't, just say no. Like how is this a different kind of saying no to
Right. Well,
something?
so the phrase "say no to drugs" or
Right.
just say no to drugs, for example, I think most people now recognize that was pretty useless at best. And I think the problem is in any kind of direction, and certainly any kind of negative direction, has to um, has to address something that you can actually do yourself. That is, I'm not tensing my neck only assumes that you know how to tense your neck and you know what no means. And so you have it within your power to request of yourself not to do this thing that you know how to do. But just saying no to drugs, it makes it seem like it's just a question of, well, first of all, just semantically, what does that mean, say no to drugs? I mean, it's kind of like the war on drugs. I mean, who are you fighting exactly? Saying no to drugs is for someone who, say, is addicted to a drug, is really not addressing, I don't think, the actual issue that they might possibly at some point have some control over. It's such a complicated thing with so many social and psychological interconnections that it's not really a negative direction. The negative direction version might be I'm not taking drugs or I'm not using drugs. I think that's a tricky one just because it's so broad and it assumes so much about your ability that it's probably not going to be that effective, you know?
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, aside from the conversation we could have about failed social policy, I think that that's
Right.
absolutely totally misunderstanding. I mean, the any addict who is getting to a point where they can say no in the moment to picking up, a drink or a drug, has already accepted a certain number of facts about their situation. And so, in terms of being powerless over it, for example, and so being
Right.
able to say no. So to just kind of toss it off and say, well, just say no. Well, that's silly because if you could do that, you wouldn't. That automatically means you're not an addict, I think.
Right.
But
Right.
um, but I think I'm kind of thinking about it as the addiction to end gaining.
Mhm.
Is actually a broader application. And so you can't just say, no, I'm not going to end gain. I'm saying no to end gaining, for example. You have to take it bit by bit. And so, yeah, ultimately, we want to be paying attention to the means that we're using.
Right.
Um, but in order to do that, it's that momentary, I am doing something and I'm not doing something else. Or, you
Right.
know,
Right.
um,
But I do think, just to veer off into the topic of metaphysics here for a moment, you okay with that?
That's one of my favorite topics, Robert.
Well, the kind of affirmations that people in that field like are things like, "Oh, I'm, I'm receiving God's grace," or something like that, or whatever. It doesn't even have to use the word God. Divine. I'm allowing divine energy to enter myself. That kind of thing.
The kind of positive
Positive,
affirmation,
yeah, they're very big
the
on
things that
positive, right?
post on your mirror or your refrigerator.
Exactly. I'm
Yes.
getting healthier every day, whatever.
Yes.
Um,
Uh-huh.
uh, I think there is a place where negative directions would actually be a great benefit. So let's say what you're intending is I'm not, um, I'm allowing God's good to enter myself, something along those lines. Well, that kind of assumes that you know how to do that, which may not be the case. I think you're safer, and I think it's more effective to say, I'm not restricting the flow of
Mm,
God's good
mm.
to me, or I'm not preventing the free expression of God's good in my life. There, you're on much safer ground because you know that you know how to prevent that from happening. I mean, that's everyone has that ability. And so you're saying no to restricting or blocking it.
That's a
And
great, great example of negative directions, I think. I'm thinking about instead of posting something like, I am worthy of love, that
mhm,
you say, you know, I am not stopping the flow of love in my life. It's a
yes,
negative direction, but it's automatically more positive.
I believe so. And you can substitute a lot of different words for stopping. You know, you can pick and choose however you feel is most useful in the moment. So I'm not preventing God's good for whatever from, you have a huge range of options within the framework. I am not blank my blank. So my life or my being at the end, or stopping, preventing, restricting, any of those things. And I think in general, when you have a huge range of possible negative directions available to you, that's a tremendous advantage, because it means if you're not really sure which one to use, you may have one or two or three that you could always come back to, but you might think, oh, in this particular situation, maybe this phrase would be most useful. So you have a lot to pick and choose among. And I think it's much easier to deploy those directions when those choices are there for you.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and it gives a lot of latitude to both teachers and students in terms of how they want to apply their clear thinking in any activity.
Hmm.
Do you have any other thoughts about negative directions? Anything else you'd like to
Well,
add?
I think it might be worth making explicit they're sort of I've come to realize this lately, and I was talking about this with another teacher yesterday. They're really kind of two very closely related categories of negative directions. One is of the type, I'm not tensing my neck, sort of directed at specific categories within yourself, specific states of being. I'm not tightening my torso, I'm not tightening my legs, whatever. And the other is saying no to the activity you're doing. Whether it's lying on a table, I'm not lying on the table, or walking, I'm not walking, or I'm not chopping vegetables, or I'm not painting, or I'm not climbing the stairs, whatever, which gets at a lot of the same stuff, but kind of gets at it more in the context of a specific activity, or in the case of lying down, a specific non activity. So I think it's
And
worth kind
yeah.
of bearing in mind those two categories, that you can switch back and forth between them. And again, it gives you this whole, it kind of doubles the range of possibilities for you, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, that actually makes sense because within a certain activity, it might be more useful to say I'm not engaging my habit that I've noticed that I tend to stand more on one side, one leg than the other, and so now I'm standing and I'm not engaging my habit. I'm not listing to one side. So there's that, and then the other is once you're there, and I'm not standing, and what does that do? you
Absolutely.
know
Yeah.
so yeah, that makes a lot of
And
sense.
here's the amazing thing, which I don't pretend to understand how this works. But let's say you have a habit in walking that's a little detrimental. Let's say you tend to push your chest forward and compress your torso when you're walking, and then you say, well, I'm not walking, and maybe you'll notice that you're a little more easily upright, and the walking, your feet are coming down less heavily on the ground, which is, almost certainly an improvement. The question that I've thought about a lot, but I have no answer for, is when you say I'm not walking, meaning I'm not walking in my habitual way of walking. How is it that your psychophysical mechanism always, and always in my experience, finds a better way? Because in theory, it could say, oh, okay, I got another way that's even worse than what you've been doing. Well,
And
let's
that's
try
often
this one on for size. But that never happens. And it's good that it never happens, because otherwise you'd have a 50-50 chance of making things worse when you use them. And I don't know why that is or how that is, but I know for sure that it is. I've never had a student do things in a worse way when they were genuinely projecting a negative direction. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Just from a
Yeah.
theoretical point of view. And I
I
guess
hadn't really thought about it in that way, but that's really
it's
when
fascinating
it
to me.
works, it's
Yeah.
there when you really stay out of your own way, then what needs to happen happens.
Yeah, you make an improvement. And the beauty is that let's say you are walking beautifully. You are a perfect walker with no excess tension. And you say to yourself, I'm not walking, then, well, nothing's going to happen. And that would be just fine. You know, you're not going to end up walking in a worse way for saying that. It'll just be, oh, well, I'm already doing it just fine, so no need to change anything. So you can't
Really
really go
interesting.
wrong, is what I'm saying. And I guess the final thing I'd like to say is that and we mentioned this in the earlier interview, it's Missy Vineyard who really brought this out to
Hmm.
everyone's attention 4 or 5 years ago in her book, and we'll have a link to her book near these interviews. But they do go back to Alexander. I think Alexander did not perhaps explicitly use them as much as we're talking about now. I think he probably hadn't really figured that out yet. But in his aphorisms, his famous various aphorisms, I found one that's just perfect, and I think he's quoting a student, but he says, "I see at last that if I don't breathe, I breathe." I mean,
Mm.
so I think negative directions combine his concept of inhibition, which just means saying no to something you don't want, but more often seen in terms of stopping, and positive in direction. I think he's really combined. I think Missy has really combined those two, and I think it's a major advance in Alexander technique teaching pedagogy, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I agree.
A huge
Absolutely.
advance. And
Yeah, it is, and it's and because it's an advance because it completely reinforces what we knew before now. You know, it's
yeah,
not instead of or adding to or anything. It's just a deepening of understanding
it's
the
in line
process.
with Alexander's several statements to the effect, I've just scratched the surface of this field of investigation. And I think he says somewhere, I hope that my work will someday be a signpost in a useful direction, that kind of thing. He knew he hadn't got it completely. And I think that this is an example of where a teacher many years later kind of figured out a way of rephrasing Alexander directions to incorporate two ideas at one time, which is a huge benefit because of this whole memory slot, sort of short-term memory slot issue that we all have, that we can't add a whole bunch of new thoughts, which is the kind of thing that happens a lot in advice, say, about posture. If you read in the paper, you'll see things that'll say, well, posture is really important at work, so watch your posture, which of course is pretty useless, and hold your chest and do this with your chin and this. So they'll have a whole sequence of useless things, and so even if they were useful, you couldn't do them anyway.
Right, which
you know?
brings us back to my original example of this meditation class where this very
Yeah.
well-intentioned teacher was giving absolutely correct information about
Yes.
the
Yes.
optimal way to be in your body to meditate, except that nobody would know if they were or wouldn't know how to actually get there. So,
Exactly. Exactly. And once you are tuned into that, you see it everywhere.
mhm.
Everywhere. Anything about advice, certainly in posture or but just in general, it's a theme out there. Um, you tell someone what to do, but you're basing it on a whole series of false assumptions. I mean, John Dewey, one of Alexander's students, a famous American philosopher, talked about this in terms of standing up straight. He said, to tell someone that to stand up straight and imagine that they're going to do anything useful with that information is like a belief in primitive magic. You might as well tell the tide not to come in today. It's that crazy. Of course, they will do something. They will make a change, but as he said, they'll just stand a different kind of badly.
Yes, exactly. And I think, yeah, so you're right that Missy has really encapsulated for us a way of bypassing that dilemma.
Absolutely. I think she gets full credit for that because I never saw that. I've never seen that anywhere else explicitly put forward like that. And I remember when I first read her book, I didn't quite know what to make of it, and I thought about it and thought about it, and then I started playing with it, and eventually I just decided that was the way to go. From my own, I started experimenting on myself and then my students, and I've talked to a number of teachers over the years who've kind of spontaneously mentioned, oh, I'm just using negative directions in my teaching now. So if you're an Alexander teacher, I highly recommend you explore it, and if you're an Alexander student, I recommend you explore it. And if you're neither of those, you might try exploring it too and see what happens. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. The next time you're driving to work,
Hmm.
just think, I'm not driving and see what happens.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Try not to have
Although
an
I got to
accident.
say, driving, I think
Probably a bad
I
example.
think that's maybe not the best place to start, just
It's
because
dangerous.
who knows. But walking or just some ordinary activity, just explore, saying I'm not doing it for a few seconds, and then switch back and forth a few times, and see what happens. You got nothing to lose.
Well, I'm not really ending this discussion, but
We can come back to this
we need to
anytime.
end
We're
it.
probably out of time. Yeah.
Robert, thank you so much for elaborating on this. That as a teacher, I've just in the last several months explicitly been working with negative directions, and I'm really looking forward to observing what happens as I continue to sort of deepen that. You've given me a lot to think about, and I hope others who are listening to this will be sparked to apply it in some interesting ways
Well,
in their work.
this has been fun. Thanks so much for the interview.